I'm 92 years old now, and I've been living alone in this house for a little over 2 decades. Time has a strange way of stretching when there's no one left to share it with. The walls remember more voices than they hear these days. There was a time when this place felt alive, when every room carried laughter, arguments, footsteps, and the kind of noise you only recognize as happiness after it's gone. I had a wife for 45 years, 2 sons, and a daughter who used to run through this hallway like she owned the world. And I had a friend, the kind of friend you don't question, the kind you trust without thinking. He lived just a few steps away from my front door, close enough that I could call his name without raising my voice, and somehow I lost all of them. Not in one moment, not in some dramatic explosion, but slowly, piece by piece, because I chose to carry a truth that was never mine to reveal. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever kept a secret that cost you more than telling the truth ever would have? If you have, just let me know in the comments. I read more than you think, and sometimes it helps to know I wasn't the only one. Her name wasn't Evelyn. Let's call her Margaret. She was 21 when we got married, and I was 24, convinced I had figured life out before it even began. We stood in a small church on a quiet street in Ohio, hands trembling, hearts certain. I remember looking at her and thinking, this is it. This is everything. A year later, we bought this house. It wasn't much. Needed paint, needed repairs, needed more money than we had. But it was ours. Every scratch on the wall, every nail hammered in place, every late-night argument about bills, it all belonged to us. And somehow, that made it perfect. Our first son, Daniel, came in '59, then Marcus in '62. And finally, our daughter, Emily, in '66. 3 kids in a house that always felt a little too small, but never empty. There were toys under the couch, dishes in the sink, and shoes scattered by the door like nobody had time to care. Back then, I used to think it was chaos. Now I know. It was life in its purest form. I worked at a manufacturing plant for 35 years. Long hours, steady pay, nothing glamorous. But I took pride in it. I took pride in providing, in coming home tired, but knowing I had built something real. A family, a life. Something that couldn't be taken away. Or at least, that's what I believed. Pride is a dangerous thing. It convinces you that what you have is permanent, that the ground under your feet is solid, when sometimes it's just waiting to give way. Our neighbor, Richard Hale, moved in around the early '60s with his wife, Susan. He had that easy kind of personality, the kind that makes you trust him before you even realize it's happening. He helped me fix a broken fence once, brought over tools without being asked, sat on the porch with me on summer evenings, talking about nothing and everything at the same time. Our families became close without effort. Holidays together, birthdays, cookouts in the backyard. The kids grew up side by side like cousins, and over time, Richard became more than a neighbor. He became part of the foundation of my life. That's what makes it harder to see the cracks. Years went by. Decades, really, and everything seemed normal, until one afternoon in the spring of 1981. Emily was 16, bright, stubborn, full of opinions. She had her whole life ahead of her, and she lived like she knew it. That day, she was in a car accident just a few miles from home. A driver missed a stop sign and hit her hard enough to send her to the hospital. I remember the drive there. I don't remember breathing. They rushed her into surgery, internal injuries, blood loss, the kind of words no parent ever wants to hear. When the doctor came out, he said she needed blood immediately. Without hesitation, I stepped forward. It wasn't a second of doubt in my mind. I would have given her everything I had. They took my blood, ran their tests, and then everything changed. The nurse came back with a look I couldn't understand at first. It wasn't panic. It wasn't sadness. It was something quieter, something heavier. She said, "Sir, your blood type doesn't match. It's not possible for you to be her biological father." I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just stood there, staring at her like she had spoken in a language I'd never heard before. Because in that moment, something inside me didn't break. It stopped. Emily survived. The hospital found the blood she needed. Within a couple of weeks, she was back on her feet, smiling like nothing had happened. But for me, nothing was the same. That night I drove home in silence. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, the same table where we had shared thousands of meals, conversations, and quiet moments. I sat across from her and asked a question that had already changed my life before she even answered. Who is her father? She didn't panic. That's what stayed with me. No shock, no denial, just a long, steady look. Like she had been waiting for that moment for years. And then she said a name. Richard. It's strange how one word can erase decades. All those years. The dinners, the holidays, the trust. Him sitting in my house, laughing with my children, shaking my hand like a brother. And all along, he carried something that belonged to me. Something I didn't even know had been taken. But that wasn't what destroyed everything. What happened next? That's what took my life apart, piece by piece. I told Margaret I needed time. I didn't yell. I didn't leave. I just needed to think. Because no matter what the truth said, Emily was still my daughter. I had raised her, loved her, watched her grow into the person she was. And I didn't know what to do with that truth. I asked for 3 days, just 3 days to figure out how to move forward without destroying everything. But while I was trying to hold things together, Margaret was already pulling them apart. Those 3 days I asked for, they weren't quiet days like I had hoped. Not for Margaret. While I was trying to understand how to carry the truth without breaking my daughter's world, she was already rewriting the story. She didn't wait. She didn't hesitate. She picked up the phone and called Daniel first, then Marcus. She spoke to them separately, carefully, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She told them that I had been unfaithful, that I had betrayed her, that for years she had stayed silent just to keep the family from falling apart. She cried while she said it, and that mattered more than the truth ever could. Daniel called me a day later. I still remember the sound of his voice. It wasn't angry the way you might expect. It was colder than that. Controlled. Distant. Like he had already made up his mind before dialing my number. He said, "Mom told us everything." I asked him what exactly she told him, even though I already knew. He let out a breath and said, "Don't do that, Dad. Don't act like you don't know. She told us about the affair." I understood then. The first version of the story is the one people believe. I'm Bob Miller, and today I'm sharing the story of the heaviest decision I ever made. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. It doesn't matter if it's true or incomplete. Once it's heard, everything else sounds like an excuse. I could have told him the truth right then. About Margaret, about Richard. The words were there, sitting right on the edge of my tongue. But the truth didn't just belong to me. It belonged to a 16-year-old girl who had just walked out of a hospital bed, still trying to make sense of her life. If I told my sons, it would reach her. Maybe not gently, but it would reach her. And I wasn't going to let her find out like that. So I said nothing. I let my own son believe I had betrayed his mother, because the alternative was shattering his sister. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the heaviest decision a person can make. After that call, things changed faster than I could keep up with. Daniel stopped visiting. Marcus followed not long after. The house that once felt too full suddenly felt like it had too much space. And Richard, He was still there, still walking out of his house every morning, still mowing his lawn, still lifting a hand in a casual wave like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just stood at the center of everything that was falling apart. It's unsettling to watch someone live normally while your world collapses. A few months later, Marcus came by. He stood in the living room, the same place where he used to sit as a kid, but this time there was no laughter. He looked at me and said, "I don't understand why you did it, but if you just admit it and apologize, maybe we can move past this." It would have been so easy. Just a few words, a false confession, a lie that would have fixed everything on the surface. "I'm sorry." That's all it would have taken. But I knew what those words would mean. They would seal the truth away forever. They would turn me into exactly the man they believed I was. So I looked at my son, and I told him, "I have nothing to admit." The look on his face, it wasn't anger anymore. It was disappointment. Like a door closing that you know will never open again. He shook his head and walked out. And just like that, I lost him too. Emily was different. She didn't know anything about what had really happened. All she saw was a family pulling apart, tension hanging in the air. Like most children, she went toward the parent who seemed to need her more. She stayed close to Margaret, not because she chose sides, but because she didn't understand there were sides to choose from. I couldn't blame her for that. That's the part people don't talk about. When families break, it's not always about who's right or wrong. Sometimes it's just about who is hurting louder. Margaret and I stayed married. Even now, that might sound strange, but leaving would have meant giving up the only connection to my children. It would have meant letting Richard step into a role he had no right to claim. And I couldn't do that. So we stayed in the same house, at the same table, living two completely separate lives under one roof. We spoke when necessary, passed each other like strangers. The house that once held a family now held two people, pretending the other didn't exist. Years passed like that. Not quickly, not slowly, just heavily. Margaret died in 2001, a stroke, sudden, final. I sat beside her in the hospital room, holding her hand, not because everything had been forgiven, but because of instinct. You hold their hand, even if they broke you, even if they took something you can never get back. I don't know if that makes me a good man, or just a man who didn't know how to let go. After she was gone, the house felt empty. Richard was still next door, older now, slower, but still there. We would cross paths sometimes, at the mailbox, in the driveway, just a few feet apart, close enough to speak, but neither of us ever did. What do you say to someone like that? There are some truths so heavy that even acknowledging them feels impossible. Years turned into decades. Daniel never called. Marcus moved away. New life, new number, new everything. Emily, she stayed in touch. A phone call every couple of weeks. Small conversations, everyday things. Weather, work, little stories that meant everything to me. And every time she ended the call the same way. "I love you, Dad." And that is enough. That word, Dad. It was the only thing in my life that never felt broken. And maybe that's why I held on to the silence for so long. Because as long as she said that word, I could still believe I hadn't lost everything. Time has a way of circling back to things you thought were buried. Not quickly, not all at once, but eventually it brings everything to the surface. Richard died not too long ago. Cancer. Fast. Unforgiving. One day he was still walking to his mailbox, and a few weeks later, he was gone. Just like that. No conversation, no closure, no acknowledgement of the life he had quietly torn apart. For a while, nothing changed. The house next door stayed quiet. His absence didn't feel like justice. It just felt like another unfinished sentence. Then, about a month after his funeral, there was a knock on my door. It was his wife, Helen. She looked different. Not just older, but like someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. In her hands, she held a small box, worn at the edges, like it had been opened and closed more times than it should have been. She didn't say much at first, just asked if she could come in. We sat at the same kitchen table where so many things in my life had started and ended. After a long silence, she opened the box. Letters, dozens of them. Old paper, faded ink, handwriting I recognized immediately. Margaret's and Richard's. They went back years, decades even. Conversations, plans, confessions, pieces of a truth that had been hidden in plain sight my entire life. There were photographs too. One of them, I still remember it clearly. Richard holding Emily as a baby. Not in this house. Not in any place I had ever seen. Helen's hands were shaking when she said, "I didn't know. Not all these years. I didn't know." And I believed her. Because I had lived with Margaret for nearly half a century, and I hadn't known either. Some people aren't just good at lying. They're good at building entire lives around those lies. She asked me what I wanted to do with everything in that box. For a long time, I didn't answer, because that box, it wasn't just proof. It was a choice. The same choice I had been avoiding for decades. Finally, I said, "Send them to Daniel and Marcus." She nodded. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. "What about Emily?" And for the first time in a long time, I didn't have an immediate answer. I looked at that box again, at the years it represented, at the damage it had caused, and I said quietly, "Not yet." A few days later, the phone rang. It was Marcus. I hadn't heard his voice in decades, but I knew it instantly. Some things don't fade, no matter how much time passes. He didn't say hello the way people usually do. His voice broke before he even got the words out. "Dad." I can't explain what that word felt like after so many years. It wasn't just a word. It was something being returned to me that I thought I had lost forever. He told me he had read everything. The letters, the truth, all of it. And then he said something that stayed with me. I spent half my life being angry at the wrong person. I didn't tell him he was wrong. I didn't tell him he should have known better. I just said, "You believed your mother. That's what children do." There was a long silence after that. Then he asked the question I had been expecting for years. "Why didn't you tell us?" I closed my eyes when he said it, because the answer had never changed. Because telling you would have meant telling you about Emily, and I wasn't willing to do that to her. Another silence. Then, softer this time, he said, "You lost all of us, just to protect her." And I answered the same way I always had in my own mind. Yes. A few days later, Daniel came to see me. Older, slower, carrying years of distance in the way he stood at the door, like he wasn't sure if he belonged there anymore. He walked inside and looked around the house like it was something from another life. We sat at the same table, and for a while, neither of us said anything. Then he looked at me and said, "I should have asked you, even once. I should have just asked." Maybe he should have, but I understood why he didn't. Because when someone you trust tells you something with tears in their eyes, you don't question it. You accept it. That's how families break. Not always through lies alone, but through the trust that allows those lies to grow. Emily still doesn't know. She's 60 now, lives a quiet life, still calls me every couple of weeks, still says the same thing at the end of every conversation. I love you, Dad. And every time she says it, I pause for just a second longer than I should. Because I know something she doesn't. And I've spent my entire life protecting her from it. Daniel and Marcus think she deserves to know. Maybe they're right. Maybe the truth is something everyone has a right to, no matter how painful it is. But I've had 60 years of being her father. Not by blood, but by everything that actually matters. And I don't know if I have it in me to take that away from her. Some people would call that selfish. Maybe it is. Or maybe it's the only thing I have left to give her. Last Sunday, Marcus came by again. We sat at this same table, the one that has held more truth than any place I've ever known. He reached across and held my hand for a while. No anger, no distance, just presence. And for the first time in longer than I can remember, I didn't feel like the villain in my own story. I wasn't the man who destroyed his family. I wasn't the one who betrayed their trust. I was just Dad. And sometimes, after everything that's been lost, that's enough.